Hello and welcome to the third episode of A Picture and 1,000 Words. I'm Michael Fiedler. The title of this episode is It's Okay to Change Your Mind. Now, I'm someone who's guilty of this. I've been known to be all about one thing for a long time and then radically change my mind and go a different direction. A quintessential example of this was towards the end of graduate school. I had it in my head that I want to go to law school. I thought it would be a fun way to write and talk for a living. And I studied for the LSAT, applied to law schools, got in, had offers. But then I went to go visit a law school in New York City, got a sense of what it was going to be like to actually be a lawyer, and then realized I wanted to back out of it. And I changed my mind, and I started a career in medical communications, and looking back on it 10 years later, it's probably one of the best decisions that I've ever made. And I've been somewhat self-conscious about this compulsion, and I think a lot of us are. I think in this day and age, we put things out in the public domain via social media or whatever other conduits, and people can be aware of our opinions, of our thoughts, and we can be really self-conscious about pivoting. And so we'll either really dilute our opinions or we will be afraid to revise them. But I came across an article a few months ago where Jeff Bezos, who was talking about how he identifies really smart people, and one of the traits that he looks for is an ability to change your mind. And so that was really reinforcing. I was like, well, if one of the most successful business people in history thinks it's okay to change your mind, maybe it's okay for me to change my mind. And what's odd is that oftentimes it leads to tremendously positive outcomes, which is sort of what brings me to the slide that you're looking at. And what I wanted to do with these various illustrations is articulate examples of people radically changing their minds and leading to positive outcomes. So starting in the upper left with green eggs and ham, I should preface this with the fact that I now have a young son, and so I spend a lot of time reading children's books. And what I'm fascinated with is just how powerful some of the messages in these books can be. And I think as adults, we grow up and we sort of get caught up in our individual circumstances, and we think that these messages no longer apply, or they don't apply to us, or that we sort of lose our naivete. But in reality, the messages in these books are actually quite profound, and Green Eggs and Ham is no exception. And so in this book, you have a character who is totally against something, won't do it, finally complies and is willing to open up their mind to a different possibility. And bam, completely radically changes directions. And I think that's a really powerful message. Moving into the second example, what you see there is a depiction of the Buddha, or Gautama Buddha, who was actually born a prince. And for 29 years, lived as a prince, and then one day decided to leave the palace and go explore reality, which he had been shielded from by his father, and began to see the harshness of the real world. And that's actually what compelled him to seek enlightenment and ultimately achieve nirvana, which formed the bedrock of the Buddha religion. And so one person dramatically changing their way of living has altered the course of human history. The next example is that I wanted to present is the 13th Amendment, or essentially the ending of slavery. And what you have here is an economic construct that existed for hundreds, thousands of years, but at a certain point in time, we as humans, we realize that it's totally immoral to subjugate one person as a slave, and it really is a testament to us achieving a level of human decency. And I think there were a lot of losers in this situation in terms of economic power, but the moral cost just was no longer worth it. And I think that if this was 150 or 200 years ago, people would be like, no, we can't get rid of slavery. It's going to ruin everything. But in reality, it's probably one of the biggest steps forward in mankind. Moving on to the next one, you have women's suffrage, which, similar to slavery, is all about equality and treating people as human beings. And I think at the time, and you can look back at old political cartoons, there was a lot of vitriol against women and giving them this opportunity. And it almost seems ridiculous now, but for a long time, women couldn't vote. It's just, this is within the last 100 years. But finally, people were open-minded enough to say, well, you know what, maybe it's worth it to give people, half the population, the right to vote. And this is a huge step forward in terms of modernity and giving people the right to speak their minds. And this was a huge accomplishment, even though nowadays it kind of seems almost ridiculous that you would restrict this level of privilege in a democracy. Drifting into the next one, around the same time, you have prohibition ending. Now, this is sort of the beginning of controversy, or at least an example of controversy, where there were a lot of people that were against people drinking, and I think that you can make a rational argument for that. But regardless of how you want to swing it, or how you want to look at it, prohibition didn't work. It actually led to bigger problems than it solved, and I think it demonstrates an example of the fallacy of restraining people's personal choice. And whether you're for alcohol or against alcohol, prohibition ultimately ended, and there was a revision in the way that people thought about drinking, and it I don't want to say it's led to immensely positive outcomes, but it has certainly allowed for people to exercise their own personal free will. The next example is a colorful illustration of the end of the Vietnam War. Vietnam was a really tricky time, and it was predicated on the premise of the spread of communism, and there was a lot of fear. And what I think is interesting is that in a lot of these examples, fear is a real driver of a fixed mindset, and being afraid of something can really hold you in your opinions, whether or not that's rooted in reality. But first you had the French, then you had the U.S., and fought in this really grossly violent conflict, and you had a whole nation of protesters who finally won out. And what you're seeing here is a really interesting example of almost this. I like to think of this as the same poor judgment of pushing a multi-million-dollar piece of equipment into the water as a microcosm for being involved in the Vietnam War in the first place. And I think this really highlights a real shift in the way people thought about this war. And I'm sure that those that were around for it can appreciate how relieving and empowering it was to get out of this conflict and to change the way that we thought. Moving into the next one, what you have here is the end of the Berlin Wall. And I think that this is topical now because there's talk in the political landscape about building a wall, but I'm not going to go any further on that. But in this particular example, you have a leader in the name of Mikhail Gorbachev, who realized that the elements of communism, despite the preference for communism to win out, just wasn't working, and these types of politics and policies were just not in the best interest of the populace. And so Gorbachev decided to just shift his thinking and move away from the traditional Soviet communist ideologies into a more reform mindset, and that led to the end of the Cold War and the coming down of the Berlin Wall. And you have this dramatic example of a total shift in the way that people were thinking. Moving into the next example in the lower left, once again returning to controversy, you have the legalization of gay marriage. And I think that there are probably people listening to this that are not a fan of this, that are sort of opposed to this, but they can't argue with the fact that it has happened and that now it's a nationwide right. And I think that much like the example above it with prohibition, it highlights an example of trying to restrain people's personal choice. And I think as a populace in this country, I think it's a step forward for us to give people equal rights and equal dignity, as this article highlights. And then the next one, similarly controversial, is the legalization of cannabis. And I think for at least the baby boomers to think that cannabis would be legal after so many administrations had demonized it and called it as one of the biggest sort of like sins of the family. In the use of illicit drugs, it's now has been shown to be really positive in a whole host of different medicinal contexts, and now it's even approved recreationally in many states, and it's probably going to be approved in more. And this is progress, and this is a total shift in the way that people think and the way that us as a country are governed. And one of the things that I learned in sort of exploring this topic and sharing some of these ideas with my wife is that if you think about the more immediate and more recent changes, like legalization of cannabis and gay marriage, they feel really raw, and people can be pretty sore about them. But if you go all the way back to women's suffrage or ending of slavery or even the Buddha, they seem like no-brainers. And so I think that it's really difficult to change your mind. I think people can be really reluctant to do it, and there really is a fear of defending that position. But I think that the real message here is that the why, sort of the WHY of why you are changing your mind, is really rooted in what you learned. What What were you exposed to? What evidence came to light that got you to revise your opinion? That may require you to be open-minded, which is tricky. Most people don't want to be open-minded, or at least some people don't want to be open-minded. But if you are open-minded and you are open to new evidence, new pieces of information, new ways of looking at things, you may be open to changing your mind, and that's okay. It's okay to rethink how you act and how you live and what things that you do and how you look at other people and how you look at other cultures, and having a fixed mindset may not lead to the best outcomes. And that's the overall message. And I think that if you're just efficient in doing so and kind of get past it, time will heal these wounds and you can move on. But this is my giving the world or anybody listening permission that it's okay to change your mind. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed this episode. Take care.